The history of the United States is filled with stories of freedom, expansion, and the pursuit of happiness. But buried under these stories is another truth: the history of violence, displacement, and death faced by Native Americans. The question we need to ask is, did the United States commit genocide against Native Americans? To understand this, we need to look at the events that shaped the relationship between Native Americans and European settlers. When the first European settlers arrived in North America, they were not the first people to inhabit the land. Native American tribes had been living on the continent for thousands of years. They had rich cultures, traditions, and societies. But with the arrival of the settlers, everything changed. The land that Native Americans had lived on for generations was suddenly seen as new and empty by the settlers. As more Europeans arrived, they began taking land that belonged to Native American tribes. At first, they made agreements and treaties, promising to share the land. But over time, these promises were broken. The settlers wanted more land to grow crops and build their towns. They pushed the Native Americans off their land, and many times they used violence to do so. In the early 1800s, the United States government decided it was time to expand westward. This was called Manifest Destiny, the idea that the U.S. was destined to spread across the continent, no matter who was already living there. The government passed laws that allowed them to take Native American land. One of the most infamous events was the forced relocation of thousands of Native Americans from their homelands to lands west of the Mississippi River. This event is known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands of Native Americans, including men, women, and children, died from hunger, disease, and exhaustion during this forced march. But the violence didn't stop there. As the U.S. expanded, Native American tribes were attacked, killed, and pushed further and further away from their lands. The U.S. Army fought wars against Native American groups, often using brutal methods to destroy their communities. One example is the massacre at Sand Creek, where U.S. soldiers killed over 150 men, women, and children from the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes. This was not the only massacre. There were many others. In addition to direct violence, the U.S. government introduced policies that aimed to destroy Native American culture and way of life. Native American children were taken from their families and sent to boarding schools, where they were forced to abandon their language, religion, and traditions. These schools were designed to civilize Native Americans by making them adopt European customs and beliefs. Many children died in these schools from poor conditions and neglect. The introduction of diseases like smallpox, to which Native Americans had no immunity, also played a major role in the destruction of Native American populations. Entire communities were wiped out by these diseases, and the death toll was staggering. The impact of these diseases was not accidental. Some historians argue that the spreading of disease was part of a plan to weaken Native American resistance to European settlers. Now, the word genocide refers to the deliberate and systematic destruction of a group of people. Genocide can happen in many ways: through mass killings, displacement, destruction of culture, or even spreading disease. Some argue that the actions of the United States toward Native Americans fit the definition of genocide. They believe that the government, and later the U.S. military, intentionally sought to eliminate Native American tribes and their way of life. On the other hand, some people argue that the U.S. government did not intentionally set out to wipe out Native Americans as a group. They say that the violence and destruction were the result of ignorance, greed, and the desire for land. While this is true, it doesn't change the fact that Native Americans suffered immensely during this period. One of the key arguments for genocide is the long-term effect of U.S. policies on Native American communities. Many Native American tribes were forced to move to reservations, where they were often confined to small, poor areas of land. These reservations were often in areas where farming was difficult, and the government provided little support for the people who lived there. As a result, many Native Americans faced extreme poverty, malnutrition, and poor health. The violence and displacement were not isolated events, but part of a longer pattern of suffering that lasted for generations. Another important point to consider is the loss of life. Historians disagree on the exact number of Native Americans who died during the expansion of the United States, but estimates suggest that millions of Native Americans died as a result of violence, disease, and displacement. This was a devastating loss for the Native American communities, and many tribes were nearly wiped out entirely. The population of Native Americans in the U.S. dropped by over 90% from the time of European contact to the 1900s. So, did the United States commit genocide against Native Americans? It's a difficult question to answer. Some people argue that the policies of the U.S. government, the violence, the displacement, and the destruction of Native American culture fit the definition of genocide. Others argue that these events were the result of settlers' greed and the pursuit of land, not a deliberate plan to destroy Native Americans as a group. What is clear is that Native Americans faced enormous suffering and loss as a result of U.S. expansion. Their populations were devastated, their cultures were destroyed, and their land was taken from them. While the United States government may not have used the word genocide at the time, the effects of its actions are undeniable. The legacy of this history still affects Native American communities today. Many Native Americans continue to fight for their rights, for recognition of their history, and for justice. The scars of this past are not easily healed, and the question of whether the United States committed genocide against Native Americans remains an important and painful issue. In the end, we must recognize the truth about the past. Understanding what happened to Native Americans is not just about looking back at history. It's about acknowledging the pain and the loss that still affects their communities today. It's about recognizing that their story is part of the larger story of the United States, and that we cannot move forward without confronting the mistakes of the past. So, did the United States commit genocide against Native Americans? The answer is complex, but the suffering and destruction that Native Americans faced cannot be ignored.